Hello everybody, welcome back to a brand new episode of Mega Project. This one is all about the race to the South Pole. Did we cover the North Pole one yet? If we haven't, we probably will. But just before we get into the video, I do want to say, exciting announcement, I've partnered up with Amaze to give you guys the chance to win a custom Tesla Model S and $20,000. Taxes and shipping are included for Americans. Even better, every donation benefits two great causes, Give Power and 501c3. All you have to do is go to omaze.com/megaprojects and enter for your chance to win. Now, of course, it's nice to help a non-profit, but you could also win a Tesla. What do I need to say that's more than that? Just think about it now, how cool you'll look sitting in your brand new Tesla that you won on the internet. Maybe you're sitting in a park with the X-Wing doors up, a cool breeze blowing through your hair as you play your favorite dark fantasy RPG on your phone. What a dream! In all seriousness, no, this is a pair of great causes you can support. So if that sounds good to you, go enter for your chance to win a custom Tesla Model S and $20,000 at omaze.com/megaprojects. And like I said, every donation supports the work of Give Power and 501c3. Really, it's a win-win. Good luck to you. And let's finally get on with today's video. The final months of 1911, two separate expeditions departed their winter camps on the Ross Ice Shelf at the northern edge of our most foreboding continent, Antarctica. Both set a course due south. Both readied themselves for the historic, monumental challenge ahead. The race to become the first humans to reach the South Pole had begun. In just a matter of months, one of the Earth's final frontiers would be conquered, and one of the teams would return home victorious, while the other would never make it back to their camp alive. The story of the early 20th century race to the South Pole is a true, old-fashioned, swashbuckling adventure that combines unimaginable hardship with a ferocious drive to succeed at all costs. Long before helicopter rescues, GPS, and modern equipment, we knew that. This was a time of hardy pioneers and their epic journeys, a period known, appropriately, as the heroic age of Antarctic explorers. The South Pole is no doubt somewhere you've seen on TV plenty of times, but it remains one of the most utterly perplexing and foreboding locations on the planet. Antarctica is the highest, driest, windiest, coldest, and iciest continent by far, with a total landmass of 14.2 million square kilometers, which is around the same as the entire United States, plus India, plus South Africa. Around 95 to 98% of the continent is covered by snow and ice, making trekking across it for weeks on end brutally hard going. And that's before we've ever talked about temperature. During the winter months, temperatures in Antarctica can crash down to minus 60 degrees Celsius, that's minus 80 Fahrenheit, and even during the relative heat wave of the summer months, things don't get much hotter than minus 26 Celsius or minus 14 Fahrenheit. In short, if you're not prepared, there is nowhere on Earth as inhospitable for human beings. So, our story today concerns two groups of intrepid explorers who essentially raced each other to the South Pole, but they were certainly not the first ones to try, and by 1911, numerous countries around the world had already fixed their sights on reaching the South Pole first. The idea of a large southern continent stretches back to antiquity, with Terra Australis appearing on early maps used during the heyday of the Roman Empire. But before you get too excited, this didn't mean the Roman legions stamped their mark on the frozen continent, but rather the geographers at the time correctly assumed that there must be a large southern expanse of land to counterbalance the abundance of land in the north. It wasn't until the 15th century that brave explorers began inching further south, and in 1675, an English merchant by the name of Anthony de la Roche, he did have a French father, if that's why the name doesn't sound particularly English, well, he was blown off course during a voyage between Europe and South America, and he and his crew became the first people to see land south of the Antarctic Convergence, an area of water encircling Antarctica where freezing water meets the relatively warmer waters of the sub-Antarctic. Over the next 200 years, ships crept ever closer to Antarctica. Captain James Cook circumnavigated it between 1772 and 1774, and on the 7th of February 1821, an American, John Davis, became the first person to set foot on this vast and mysterious continent. Now, we should just add a quick disclaimer here and say that while it's generally accepted that Davis was the first to land on Antarctica, the truth is, we just can't be 100% sure. It wasn't for another 74 years that we had our first undisputable landing on the frozen continent in 1895. Over the next 15 years, several expeditions from Britain, France, Belgium, and Sweden slowly inched their way into the interior or surveyed the islands in the region. With public excitement growing, the race to become the first to reach the South Pole was very much on. In 1908, Ernest Shackleton's Nimrod expedition came agonizingly close when they were forced back while still 180.6 kilometers, that's 112.2 miles from the South Pole. This had been a privately funded expedition with limited resources that was hurried in its final preparatory stages. To the steely adventurers waiting in the wings, it became clear that a well-planned expedition with the right teams would likely lead to the conquering of the pole. The two teams that departed south in the summer of 1911 had hugely contrasting fortunes on the endless expanse of snow and ice. One team came from Britain and was led by the indomitable Robert Falcon Scott, a man who had led the British National Antarctic Expedition between 1901 and 1904 and had trekked overland to a then record 87 degrees north, 17 degrees south. The other team hailed from Norway and was led by the 38-year-old Roald Amundsen, who had been the first mate on the Belgian Antarctic expedition between 1897 and 1899, and also among the 6 men to complete the first successful navigation of the Northwest Passage after a 3-year voyage in 1906. The two expeditions were led by 2 of the finest, most experienced Antarctic explorers at the time, but this was an age of intense rivalry that saw men pushing themselves to the very limit to achieve some of the planet's final measurable exploratory achievements. This was a rivalry that would eventually see one man return home a hero and cost the other his life, starving to death in a tent just 20 kilometers, that's 12.5 miles, from a resupply depot that would have almost certainly saved him and his companions' lives. In 1908, Roald Amundsen announced that he would be embarking on a groundbreaking expedition to the North Pole. The announcement was met with great interest, and soon the Norwegian royal family and the government had chipped in to assist this historic attempt. Robert Falcon Scott was even kind enough to supply Amundsen with scientific instruments so that both groups could conduct the same experiments from opposite poles. The next year, however, news reached Amundsen that 2 separate expeditions had already reached the North Pole. Exactly what came next is still up for debate, but what is certain is that Amundsen's focus shifted from the north to the south pole. Like, well, if that one's done, we'll try the more difficult one. He kept this almost entirely secret and not even informed his crew when they set sail for Madeira on the 3rd of June 1910. Once on the Portuguese islands in the Atlantic, his crew were told that they wouldn't be turning north at all, but rather making the mammoth journey to Antarctica. Surprise! The ship Terra Nova set sail from Britain on the 15th of June 1910 with a crew of 65 on board. Their route took them south, with stops in South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand before plotting a course for Antarctica. Unlike the Amundsen expedition, which appeared made for speed with the sole objective of reaching the southern pole quickly, the Terra Nova expedition placed a large emphasis on geographical, magnetic, and meteorological studies, as well as further exploration of King Edward VII's Land and Victoria Land. Scott was in New Zealand when he was first informed that Amundsen was also heading south, and it didn't take long for newspapers to begin stirring the competition between the two. Scott, for his part, carefully avoided the term race and insisted that the expedition's scientific objectives would not be sacrificed to beat his Norwegian rival. Whether that's how he felt privately was quite another matter. Amundsen had an advantage from the get-go in that his base camp was 96 kilometers closer to the pole, that's 60 miles, than Scott's camp, which lay 648 kilometers, 402 miles, east of the Norwegians. Scott had chosen the western edge of the Ross ice shelf for a base because it came with a rich area around it for further exploration, and also it had been where his previous expedition had begun. After arriving on the 4th of January 1911, Scott established his winter camp, Camp Evans, and a 15.2 meter by 7.6 meter prefabricated hut was erected and made livable by January the 18th. Amundsen, on the other hand, chose the Bay of Whales further east, which is the southernmost point that a ship can get to the South Pole, so it kind of makes sense. His team arrived in the area on the 14th of January, and by the 27th, their winter camp and accompanying hut had been erected. Now, things got a little awkward for everybody involved on the 3rd of February when the two groups actually met. The Terra Nova was out scouting the area when it arrived in the Bay of Whales. Apparently, everything was cordial, and Amundsen's group invited the crew of Terra Nova for breakfast, an act that was reciprocated later in the day with lunch on board the British ship. Scott was not with the Terra Nova at the time, with his crew passing on the information once they had returned to Cape Evans. Scott later wrote in his diary with the stiffest of upper lips, "One thing only fixes itself in my mind. The proper as well as the wiser course is for us to proceed exactly as though this had not happened, to go forward and to do our best for the honor of our country without fear or panic." Both men, though, were now fully aware of the intentions of the other. Scott may have been a little perturbed by Amundsen's choosing a spot closer to the pole, while the Norwegian was said to be slightly put out to hear that Scott's motorized transportation was performing well on the ice. These were both fine, upstanding, early 20th century gentlemen, so there would of course be no distaste for competitiveness, but no doubt the fear of losing must have haunted both of the men. Before we go any further with the story, it's important to highlight some fundamental differences between the two expeditions. Amundsen was placing all of his faith in sledges and 52 dogs, whereas Scott would be using a wide variety of animals and machines. Included with the British expedition were 3 motorized sledges, 19 ponies, and a small group of dogs. There was a much discussed British aversion to using dogs for this kind of expedition, born partly out of failures in the past, but also that the British didn't have the same kind of cultural knowledge needed to operate dogs like this in these kinds of conditions for prolonged periods of time. The British ponies would not be going all the way to the pole, but rather would help with the initial depot drops along the way. With winter creeping closer, both teams set about establishing resupply depots along the route that would allow them to carry smaller amounts. The Norwegians established considerably more depots than the British, containing 3,400 kilograms or 7,500 pounds of supplies, which included 1,400 kilograms, 3,000 pounds of seal meat, and 180 liters, that's 40 gallons of paraffin oil. It's also worth noting that they went to considerably more effort in marking out where their depots lay. Scott's team laid fewer depots, which were also more spread out than their Norwegian rivals. The ponies almost immediately proved to be a bad idea, while the motorized sledges couldn't be used because of the weather. The largest depot, known as 1-ton depot, was even established 48 kilometers short of its intended location after the ponies began collapsing. Of the 8 that departed on the depot missions, only 1 pony returned. The British expedition, with that, was off to a bit of a rocky start. Now, with the depots established, there was little that the two teams could do but ride out the brutal Antarctic winter and wait for the spring. On the 8th of September 1911, with temperatures creeping upwards, Amundsen had grown tired of waiting, and after readying the sledges, dogs, and equipment, he and his 7 companions began heading south. But it was a false start that very nearly ended in tragedy. After only 4 days, and with temperatures reaching minus 56 degrees Celsius, that's minus 69 Fahrenheit, Amundsen was forced to concede that they had departed too early and that Antarctica was still very much in the grip of winter. The group backtracked haphazardly and only just made it back to camp safely. Almost a month later, on the 19th of October, the group once again prepared and set a course for the South Pole. Just under 2 weeks later, on the 1st of November, Scott and his party of 16 departed Cape Evans following a 2-man team that had left 7 days before on the motorized sledges. These sledges had gotten barely 80 kilometers before failing, leaving the 2 men to haul 336 kilograms, that's 740 pounds of supplies, for the remaining 240 kilometers, 150 miles, to where they would rendezvous with the main party. Scott's group was working in a relay system where groups would eventually peel off and return to camp. Eventually, only 5 men remained as they slogged slowly through the snow and ice, man-hauling their sledges towards the South Pole. If there was any doubt over the usefulness of the dogs, the speed and relative ease in which Amundsen hurtled towards the pole put paid to it. His team built up a sizable lead over the British expedition, and that grew to 34 days at its greatest. If this was a race, it was over before it began. Amundsen and his men arrived at the South Pole on the 14th of December 1911. The previous day, there had been a nervous moment when a black object appeared in the distance, which the team thought could have been a British flag flying in the distance, but it was just some dog crap and a confusing mirage. The Norwegian flag was firmly planted in the ground along with a small tent, which they called the Polheim, while they named the polar area Kinhak on the 7th Plateau. Amundsen later wrote in his diary, "Never has a man achieved a goal so diametrically opposed to his wishes. The area around the North Pole, devil take it, had fascinated me since childhood. And now, here I was at the South Pole. Could anything be more crazy?" On the 18th of December, the team turned north, and 99 days later, they arrived back at their winter camp after having traveled for an astonishing 3,440 kilometers, 2,137 miles. It shows just how lopsided this race had been that Scott and his 4 companions did not reach the South Pole until the 17th of January 1912, a month after the Norwegians had left. Scott famously recorded in his diary, "The pole, yes, but under very different circumstances from those expected. Great God. This is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have labored to without the reward of priority. Well, it is something to have got here." Disappointment perhaps isn't enough of a word for how the 5 men must have felt when the Norwegian flag first appeared in the distance. Not long after arriving, the team turned for Cape Evans and over the next 3 weeks made excellent progress. However, things soon started to unravel. The first to die was a man by the name of Edgar Evans, who collapsed from exhaustion on the 17th of February. At this point, the group was still on schedule, but a series of misfortunes would be disastrous for the British expedition. Firstly, a huge drop in temperature meant that dragging the sledges across the ice became increasingly difficult, with Scott likening it to dragging a sledge through sand. Then there were the resupply dog runs, or lack of them. The plan had been for a resupply mission to reach One Ton Depot where food and supplies would be left, but it never arrived. The debate over why continues to this day, and it's not entirely clear whether this was down to individual mistakes or, dare I say, cowardice, or through miscommunication. In the end, though, they didn't even make it to the One Ton Depot. The final days of the Scott expedition are difficult to comprehend. With terrible weather and weakening bodies, the group slowly struggled forward. On the 10th of March, it became clear that no extra help was coming, and the group now seemed resigned to their fate. The second to die was Lawrence Oates, who famously left the tent so as not to slow the party down further with the heartbreaking, yet now iconic final words, "I'm just going outside, and maybe some time." The 29th of March saw Scott pen his final diary entry, in which he wrote, "We shall stick it out to the end, but we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far." The point at which Scott and the 3 remaining men in his team died lay just 18 kilometers, 11 miles from the One Ton Depot, where a small amount of food and supplies remained. Their bodies were discovered frozen inside their tent by a search party on the 12th of November, and a cairn was built over it, which stands to this day. After arriving back at camp, Amundsen wasted no time before heading for New Zealand, where news of his triumph could be relayed around the world. The British press, no doubt a little miffed that it hadn't been their man, were generally positive, but there were certain grumblings about how the expedition had been kept secret until the last moment. His glorious success was of course soon contrasted with the desperate news that the revered Captain Scott had perished while attempting the same journey. Now, we British generally love our lovable, heroic failures, and in Scott, we got just that. It wasn't until the 1970s when sentiment began to shift away from the heroic failure to begin examining the mistakes Scott and his team had made. While we can nitpick about individual orders and missteps, the truth is that Amundsen and his men were far better adapted to traveling with sledges and dogs for a prolonged period. Their superior cold weather skills and knowledge were the main reasons why they were the first to reach the South Pole, and the death of Scott and his men must be attributed to poor expedition management. Few expeditions throughout history can match the extraordinary struggle that took place during 1910 and 1911. The race to the South Pole remains one of the most astonishing feats of human exploration and endurance ever seen, where the finest of margins between success and death begin to blur in the great white expanse of Antarctica. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you to Amaze again for sponsoring us. Please remember that you can donate for your chance to win a Tesla below, or just go to amaze.com/megaprojects. And as always, thank you for watching.